which is the second physical volume of the book, which is metaphysics. When we apply what we found in parts 1 and 2 to the universe, what do we find? And this involves looking at the basic elements of the cosmos, things like time and space, matter and consciousness, but also things such as values and the sense of the sacred. So that is the outline of the book, and it's that I try to convey in this introductory part of the book. So, Alex, that's probably as much as I need to say at the moment, probably more than enough. And I'd like to hand over to you now, because I'm sure you've got comments and questions.
Sure. I mean, that's fantastic. And one can see there's so much to unpack. And that's the reason why we're doing this, actually, to have this conversation. So yours is obviously an ambitious task, and it's an important task. And you argue that it's also an urgent task. And as you also mentioned a minute ago, there are all these isms, right? Materialism, reductionism, representationalism. There are all these connection of isms that, in a way, well, you're fighting against, or even better, you're trying, as you said, to invert or correct kind of the hierarchy or the superiority they have on other ways of understanding the world. Now, a distinction that you make that I think it's really, really powerful, and that's what I would like to discuss now for a little time, is this distinction between apprehending and comprehending, as illustrating these radically different views of seeing the world. And one has to do with manipulation, of course, and the other one with understanding. And I think just from the words themselves and the roots of the works, it is very powerful, both as a summary and also as a root of the cause of all these preference for certain isms that you're saying pop thinkers present as if they were true, actually, which are, in my view, abstractions, and to confront these with experience and also avoiding the common distrust we have on experience. But I wanted to ask you about experience later, but maybe we could continue with apprehending and comprehending, because it's very useful to me.
Yes, thank you for drawing attention to that. I use the word apprehend in a specific sense, which is its original sense of grasping hold of something. And this comes from the Latin root ad and prehendere, to take hold, and ad, to go to it and take it. And this is the function, I suggest, from an evolutionary point of view of the left hemisphere. It enables us to manipulate the world. The right hemisphere, I suggest, comprehends, helps us understand the world. And that comes from a root in Latin meaning to take together. And that's really an important point, because an awful lot of what I'm talking about is what follows from whether you see things as a whole and only move to focus on a part, taking into account that you're looking in an artificial way as part of a whole, and the other way of looking at it, which is you try and break it down into the smallest parts you can, understand those, and then build it back up from there. That is, of course, how we make a machine. And so it's the obvious way in which the part of the mind that grasps things and takes them apart wants to view the cosmos itself, which it didn't actually make, but imagines it is something like a machine that we could have constructed. So that's an effective difference. And as I say, a sort of soundbite would be the left hemisphere helps us apprehend or grasp and manipulate the world. The right helps us comprehend or understand it. And that distinction, as I say, is an ancient one going back at least 700 million years, and explains the otherwise baffling fact that the brain, a structure that is made to make connections, and its power exists only in the number of connections it can make, has an enormous divide down the middle. It's also asymmetrical. Why? And the band of tissues at the base of the brain, the corpus callosum, that connects those two aspects, is often inhibitory. A lot of the work it does is to tell the other hemisphere, keep out of this while I deal with it. That suggests that there are two potent ways of viewing the world that mustn't interfere with one another if they're each of them to work well to the end that they're designed to fulfill.
All right, I'll come back to apprehending and comprehending later, but since let's jump into the bihemispheric structure of the brain, because that's also the soil on which all these ideas will grow. And so we have these neurological facts that you've studied and put together in a remarkable way, because that seems to be sometimes far beyond what one person alone can hold in their mind. But there are these neurological facts that we will, of course, unpack. But then from here, you draw psychological implications, and as you said, even later, also metaphysical consequences, not just from the neurology, but also from physics and from philosophy itself. So maybe we could discuss a bit now, or as much as needed, what are these neurological facts, and probably advancing one of the usual criticisms of the split brain hypothesis and what it means, which is that, well, fine, sure, there's split and there are all these inhibitory connections and so on, but people may not be so comfortable saying more than that, as you were saying at the beginning, like drawing real world consequences of what's purely, in a way, neuroscientific data. But let's not say that there are two brains and two minds and two ways, because that seems hand waving. I think it's not at all, and probably that's a foundational stone of your whole argument. I think it will be very useful for everybody to realize, and for us to explain, for you to explain us that yes, there has been some pop psychological understanding of it, and you're not saying that. You're saying something more precise and more potent in a way. So it's a good time perhaps for you to explain that, if you may.
Yes, that's a good idea. I think it's got passed into popular culture that the idea of differences between the brain hemispheres is somehow an exploded idea that carries no scientific credibility. And that's because after the first split brain operations were carried out in the 1960s and 70s in California, the remarkable operations, we were able to study the phenomenology of one isolated hemisphere at a time and see what it is like. And it was discovered that indeed the phenomenology of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are in fact very different. The fact that we're not aware of that is because evolution has taken care to hide it from us. If we were aware that we're kind of fusing two quite different visions of the world all the time, we wouldn't be able to do anything. We would be completely incapable of action. But the fact that there were some very simple-minded deductions made in the early days, such as that the left hemisphere is linguistic and rational, and the right hemisphere emotional and artistic. These they may have vestiges of truth in them, but only vestiges, because the picture is very much more complex than that. And each hemisphere, in fact, deals with everything, including reason and emotion, and including creativity and reason. So the old differences are to be dispensed with. And I think one of the first things I would say to anybody is put out of your mind everything you think you know about the differences between the left and right hemispheres, because they will be wrong. So it is an important distinction to make, that I'm not just following up the old vision. But the question won't go away. There is, at the core of our being, this fascinating division in the brain, and therefore inevitably in the mental world. Why is it there? And what is its nature? And I unpack those ideas in the whatever it is 9 chapters, I think, of part 1, and we'll probably look at those in greater detail on another occasion. Yeah.
So here, let me add a kind of a footnote referring to your biography in a way, because I think it's remarkable that what you're putting forth it is a brave endeavor in the sense that you're walking a fine line, right? Because you're emphasizing how the structure of the brain shapes this way of attending the world that we have as individuals and as a society and as a culture and as a civilization, right? But at the same time, you have to be very careful, and you lay it out in the introduction where you explain first the kind of headline differences between the hemispheres and then the common confusions, because since the publication of the Master and his emissary, you've had time to see what people think and what they criticize, right? So you need to walk this fine line by saying, well, yes, I'm drawing a lot of neural data, but I am not saying that mind is just a derivative of brain stuff, and so on and so forth, right? And this is also related to your path as a scholar, right? Where you wanted to study this, which seems this hemisphere difference, which maybe seemed like a worn out idea, but it was actually underexplored. And nevertheless, so you were advised not to do so, as I understand. Nevertheless, you went for it, right? So you see how interesting. I mean, just again, it's a footnote because we'll go back to the content again. But I think as you emphasize context as being something very important, I want to draw attention to the fact of the context as you as a scholar while approaching these ideas, because that's important. In the wider picture of things, there are these ideas that either are pushed to the side, and if you want to go and study them, you're usually advised not to do so because that's not career building. But it's in doing that one can make progress. So if you don't mind to tell us a bit more about that path of yours, and we can quickly go back to the content of the book, if you wish.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I all my life really I've been interested in philosophical questions, and in philosophy one is looking at the structure of ideas, putting them in contrast with one another, in connection with one another. And this is in some ways the opposite of what people often think the process of science should be, which is taking things apart and looking at them as separate, discrete facts or data points. And this is so strong that we've lost really the whole purpose of science, which in the end, yes, you have to do a lot of analysis, a lot of taking things apart, but the purpose of doing so is not fulfilled just in doing that process. That's an intermediary step. The whole point of doing that is to be able to use that information to enrich one's understanding and one's picture of the whole. And in fact, I start from a point made by Erwin Schrödinger in the years just after the Second World War, when he was lecturing in Cambridge. Schrödinger, of course, one of the great figures in the development of quantum mechanics in the last century. He said, really, the point of scientific research is only fulfilled in as much as it begins to help us understand the question, who are we? And he's actually quoting Plotinus, a Greek scholar of the 3rd century. And what Plotinus was asking is the question that we seem to have lost sight of, and I think is damagingly lost sight of. We seem to have lost any idea, the remotest idea of who we are and what we're doing here. And it's in an effort to help understand that question that I wrote this book. So it's inevitable that one tries to see the picture in a sense that makes sense as a whole, and also makes sense in the context of a human life. What I found is that a lot of people who are specialists in the field of neurology have gravitated to my ideas, but those who work purely in laboratory science in the neurosciences have tended not to. And I think what we see there is that there is no way in which somebody who is a physician or a surgeon who is actually dealing with real people can ignore the the blatant evidence that these two parts of the brain work in different ways and produce different kinds of experience for the individual. Whereas if you are looking at a technical detail distanced by expensive and elaborate machinery in a laboratory, you will neither be thinking in terms of where this fits into the whole picture, and nor will you welcome somebody who comes along and says, actually, this has human meaning. So that is the conflict, I think. But I'm so convinced that there is meaning here. This was apparent to me 20 or 30 years ago and was enough at that stage. I knew very much less than I do now, but I could also already see certain important connections. And it was that led me to be audacious enough to disregard the kind and very well-meant advice of my mentors and older colleagues, which was to not touch this question of hemisphere difference with a barge pole because it would be career destroying. Somehow I have a perverse desire to face certain risks if they seem important and central enough. And I just want to, before I finish on this, I just want to pick up something you said there, which was that I don't suggest that the mind is purely an emanation of the brain. We'll come on to that very much later in other talks, I hope. But what at least one can say is that the way in which we think, our mental world, is to some extent shaped by the brain. It may not be caused by the brain, but it is nonetheless formed by the brain. It has to come via the brain, and that leaves impression on our sense of the world.
Lovely. And actually this fits back into your fine line walking between truth as something that's out there, unattainable, or something that doesn't exist, and putting it more towards a path to truth. And you are doing the same with reality, which is what I wanted to ask you next. So you have in the introduction these acronyms, right, for the two views of conceiving reality out there, ROT. I don't know if in English that should be pronounced rot. And then you have the made up miraculously by ourselves, the mambo version. And of course, again, you are in the virtuous middle, right? And particularly, there is this quote of yours, which I would ask you to unpack, which I think can help at least me, because that's something I care a lot, to understand to what extent, as you said, you're not saying the world is nothing of us, nor it's just made up entirely by us. And you're right, quote, "It is true that we can see the world only partially, but we still each see the world directly." And I think this is very important, especially, I mean, this is an important problem always, but especially today, where, as you know, there are these tides of thinking, both in pop philosophy and science, but also injecting in the real people of the real world, where we're told and hammered that the world is just a hallucination, that everything we perceive, it's kind of the matrix all the time, but it's a matrix where even if you escape from the matrix, you would still doubt that you're still in a simulation again. Now, having somebody write like you that we see the world directly, which is something I believe as well, I think it's a very strong claim, and sometimes can be just be there modestly in a paragraph. I think it's essential. So if you could also help us understand your position with respect to idealism, and in what sense we have direct access to the world, which goes back to apprehending and comprehending, I think. And also you emphasize representation or representing versus the world as presented to us without kind of a second-hand dealer that hands it in. Yeah.
Yes, and indeed, even more striking is if one expresses it using a neologism which has come into philosophical language from the German of Heidegger, the idea of something presencing, which is slightly different from being is present, because is present sounds passive, as though the thing just is manipulated, whereas presencing is something active, and I believe that the world actively engages with our consciousness, which is also actively engaging with it. The idea that it's all a hallucination or a projection on an internal screen is completely understandable, but I think deeply mistaken. It's completely understandable in this sense. If the left hemisphere, which only sees the representation of the world, were to try and explain what is going on, this is exactly the picture it would come up with. The idea of a homunculus sitting inside the brain, watching a screen in a chamber that has no windows on the world, and that this is what we take for reality. First of all, I think it would be remarkable if this were the case, if there were as much agreement between us as to what is going on in the world as there is. We mustn't emphasize, it is certainly true that we can be deceived in what we find in the world, and some people see the world in a very strange way, and this is often the case with people that we talk about as having a mental illness, hallucinating. But although that is a reality, the fact is that there is an extraordinary commonality in the ways in which we find the world to be. What I try to explain is that it is something like the way in which we appreciate a work of art, and perhaps particularly helpful is a piece of music. So take the example of Mozart's G minor quintet. This is not something that just exists